I arrived at the townhouse just after sunset, the last streaks of orange snagged on the rooftops like burning thread. The lock was stubborn, the kind that made you feel judged by a door. I jiggled the key and the bolt slid with a sound like an old throat clearing. Inside was lemon cleaner and cool plaster, the hush of a place between lives. My suitcase wheels ticked across a runner that had seen other footsteps, other hesitations. I'd taken the sublet on short notice, 3 nights while the owner was away for work, a vague phrase at the end of a brief email chain. She'd left the keys under a cracked terracotta pot and a printed note on the hall table. Please keep the curtains closed after 10. Do not leave the foyer light on. I read it twice. It had that particular stiffness of rules that had been repeated often. The foyer was a long, narrow lung. The air felt like it waited to see what you'd do. A mirror hung at the end of the hall, beveled edges shivering with antique patina. I watched my own shape glide toward me, slightly delayed by the glass, and snorted at myself for noticing. I set my bag down, touched the wall. The paint was the color of dry bone. In the living room, a tall lamp with a pleated shade spooled warm light over a low couch. The floorboards conveyed every step to every other room. Somewhere in the bones, an old house whispered to itself, expanding, shrinking, making sense of temperature. I told myself that. I said it aloud. Old houses talk. My voice fell into the rugs. A kettle in the little kitchen took its time. On the counter, an empty fruit bowl had collected dust like fine gray lace. Outside the sink window, a narrow yard pressed up against a brick wall. The brick gave off the day's hoarded heat with a smell of late sun and moss. The shape of the yard was a cutout of darkness, the sky above it a deeper blue, and I felt an odd reluctance to turn on the porch light. The note on the hall table waited in the corner of my vision like someone with a raised hand. The kettle shrieked. I poured the water, made tea, and carried the mug back to the couch, blowing steam, settling in. The house handled my weight like a puzzled animal. I put on a slow video to soothe the travel static in my head, the kind where someone cleans an old silver coin with baking soda and a toothbrush, and let myself be captured by the smallness of it. That was when I heard it, a soft scuff at the front door, as though a socked foot adjusted stance. Then nothing. The steam from my mug went sideways, a draft thin as a drawn thread slipping across the room. I felt it more than the sound, a slight adjustment of the house around me, a new listener. I paused the video. Silence layered itself, one sheet, another. In the kitchen, the refrigerator motor hummed and then stopped like a held breath. I told myself it was the old throat-clearing door, the settling of wood. I told myself I was tired. I stood and walked to the foyer. The mirror watched me arrive. In its dim, my face looked like it had been copied from memory. I reached for the foyer switch and stopped, my fingers a breath from the toggle, the note in my mind as though I'd just read it again. Do not leave the foyer light on. It wasn't 10 yet. My phone said 21:34. I flipped the switch down anyway, leaving the foyer to the spill of the living room lamp. As my eyes adjusted, the glass of the beveled mirror gathered the faint light into a thin aureole around my shape. I took a step closer. My reflected self took a step, but something about it lagged by a heartbeat. My hand lifted, then its hand, a pocket of time slightly wrong. The illusion was probably a function of the bevel or of my nerves, the way your head invents a second to prove it's paying attention. Still, I found myself lifting my hand again, slower, testing. The reflection matched me perfectly now, and I laughed at nothing, at myself, at the way a long day rewires the simple act of trust. From upstairs came a light thump, followed by the faint sliding whisper of cloth against wood, the tail of a curtain pulled through fingers. I held still, every sound rising to the skin of my ears. The ceiling ticked the way old paint does. The upstairs landing would have a window. Perhaps a draft had bellied a curtain, dropped something small. It's an old house, I said to the air. I said it with less conviction. I took the stairs. They were narrow and tired, the varnish cropped away where many feet had negotiated the same route. At the top, a short hall gave into 3 doors, the bathroom, bright with modern tile and the smell of eucalyptus soap, a smaller room with a futon and stacks of storage bins, and the main bedroom, darker than it ought to have been, heavy with a closed-in quiet. The curtains, thick wool, were drawn tight. I felt my way to a pull cord and tugged. They unzipped the night in a single motion, revealing the window's square of sky and the distant shoulder of a tree. A street lamp somewhere off to the left cast a pale trapezoid across the floorboards, and in that trapezoid my shadow arrived before I did. I froze. The light was weak, guttered by the heavy cloth, but the shape pooled on the floorboards didn't belong to my stance. My arms were at my sides, and the shadow's arm tensed, as though in the act of being raised. An optical trick again. I moved my hand left. The silhouette didn't move. Then it did. A half-second later, a fraction off, a smudged echo catching up. "Neat," I said, and discovered my mouth had gone dry. I stood there a bit too long, watching my outline stir with every breath. It felt like getting to know a stranger in my clothes. I pulled the curtains closed, and the light trapezoid folded itself up and into absence. The room exhaled a darker temperature. Back downstairs, I tried to read. My tea had cooled. The soundtrack of the house became a deep aquatic pulse, all boards and rafters and pipes trading warmth. Periodically, there was that scuff at the door, the most polite of intrusions. I convinced myself it was a low branch scraping the panel. At 22:06, I got up to close the living room curtains too, because the night pressing against the glass felt like a face. When I drew the fabric, a street face of reflected room swam toward me. Lamp, couch, picture frames, me, and behind me, a smudge in the reflection moved. I turned too quickly, spilling a soft curse. Nothing there but the chair and my bag. On the TV, a paused hand held a toothpick against a coin in infinite patience. The line of the hallway was a well. The beveled mirror had gone from old gold to varnished black. I told myself to breathe and found I had been holding my breath for long enough to hurt. I unlocked my phone out of habit, without intention, the way you do when your hands need to be busy. No messages. The note from the owner stared from an earlier thread. A floorboard popped under my foot, sharp as a knuckle crack. Somewhere, a soft flit of movement like a moth inside a lampshade. "Okay," I said. I walked to the foyer. The brassy threshold plate was cold through my socks. I reached for the switch and then decided I didn't want the beveled mirror fully alive. I didn't want to see the house clarified into edges. I stood with my hand on the wall, fingers spread, feeling how a place held its breath. The front door, with its frosted glass oval, admitted the suggestion of streetlight like diluted milk. My shadow bled outward from my feet, long and transparent, and then, like a fish turning in dark water, it shivered against the grain of the boards as if the light had sharpened for a heartbeat. The line of my shoulder seemed to tilt without me. Something pressed, just there, at the corner of my vision, a presence like a held word. I turned my head slowly, because that was the bargain I had with myself. We would be measured, unhurried. Nothing. The mirror gave back a long smear of not quite me. I did what people do. I backed up into the safety of more light. I went to the kitchen. I ran water just to hear a normal noise. The sound flayed out against tile and stainless steel and made the house sound inhabited. When the water stopped, the silence jumped back in like a low tide reclaiming rocks. A text came in from an unknown number. "You there yet?" I frowned. The number had the same area code as the owner's, but not the same last digits. I typed, "Who is this?" The typing dots disappeared. No answer. Something bumped the side door that opened to the yard, an exploratory nudge. The doorknob gave a little metallic clink, as if agreeing. My skin tightened. The porch light switch had one of those old Bakelite plates, warm under my finger. I didn't press it. Back in the living room, I sank onto the couch and curled into the lamplight like a cat. The room seemed to approve. It let me be. "You're fine," I told myself. "You're being broken in, that's all." My eyes started to drift. I let the video unpause. A brush moved grains of powder until a date appeared on the silver. The slow patience of it smoothed my thoughts until they lay flat. Half asleep, I felt the lamp dim, just a notch, like a breath pulled back between teeth. The shade collected a little less light. The corners of the room collected a little more. The hair on my forearms, the ones not currently pressed into the couch, rose. Something crossed the living room doorway. Not outside, not on the street, not anywhere that could be mistaken for a normal passage of strangers. Across that rectangular air, from hallway to dining room, a grayness slid, self-contained, like a fish shadow gliding under a dock. It was not the shape of a person precisely. It was the absence calligraphy of one. The air seemed to fold as it went, light bending around a cold center. As it crossed, the lamp pulled down again, a quick swallow of light, then returned to itself. I bolted upright. The shadow was gone. The doorway was empty. The house waited to see what I'd do now. "Hello?" I said, and wanted to claw the word back into my throat. I stood, fingers dug into my thighs, and the floor made a sound like teeth. In the foyer, the mirror now showed the barest suggestion of my own outline and something else behind me, a faint echo, as if the glass had decided to study my shape from memory and drew a second copy with a dull pencil. When I stepped left, the echo didn't. When I stepped back, it elongated, as though it had its own relationship with the streetlight beyond the frosted oval. The note's words crawled across my mind. "Do not leave the foyer light on." Not "don't turn it on," I realized, but "don't leave it on." A permission with a warning inside it, concealed like a sliver under skin. I flicked the switch. The foyer light came up in a brittle bloom, and with it every edge sharpened. The pores in the paint, the nicked wood of the banister, the dust combs on the skirting where the vacuum had always missed by a fraction. My shadow hit the opposite wall with the suddenness of a thrown coat. It was precisely me. It was obedient. It was flat. The other one wasn't. It rose up behind me as if pulled from the floor on a fine filament. It had my outline, but thinner, like a hunger had traced me, each line slightly too narrow. It turned its head when I didn't. It lifted its hand when mine stayed at my side. The sight of it ran through me cold. My knees felt briefly not part of me. I killed the light. The house sucked it in like sugar. In the half-glow from the street, the second outline didn't vanish. It took a step toward me, though my own shadow stayed a pool at my feet. The air changed temperature, edged cooler, as if the thing in front of me were absorbing not just photons but heat, the shape of my warmth drawn out from me like thread from a spool. My teeth tapped together, not from fear, but because cold made them speak. "Who are you?" I managed. It tilted its head, my head, a little too light to be mine. Where its face should have been was only something like polished obsidian catching extremely thin light. And then faintly, from that black, a whisper that did not reach my ears through the air but through my bones. "I am what the light makes of you." In truth, I don't know if those were the words. The sense of it arrived without sounds to carry it, that it had been waiting since some other night when someone else had stood too long in the wrong place with too much light at their back, that each shadow was a draft version of a person, cut from them cleanly when the light was right, and that the beveled mirror kept count the way an old ledger keeps count of debts. Thin line, thin line, thin line, you now owe. The streetlight outside coughed once, some flaw in the bulb, and for an instant the foyer went almost entirely dark. In that instant, the shape that wasn't me slid forward until it nearly touched me, and I felt the sensation of my edges being considered, measured. The streetlight came back to itself. The not me recoiled, not in fear, but as an animal might when you step closer unexpectedly. It wanted me in better light. I backed toward the living room, toward the soft pool of the lamp. The shape came on with me, not hurrying. As we entered the lamplight, it fattened, grew more confident, the lines of it sharpening. It stretched toward the couch, toward the lamp's stem, as if a vine had found a trellis. I understood then why the note warned as it did. Light was a lure. Light was a blade. I yanked the plug. The room took a breath and relaxed into grayscale. The shape faltered, scratched faintly at the border where light had been a moment before, then turned its head toward the kitchen. The refrigerator motor sighed awake, offering a weak square of luminescence. The thing flowed that way. I ran ahead of it. I hit the kitchen switch, then thought better, then hit it anyway, throwing full wattage into tile and stainless steel. The shadow slammed into existence on the floor like spilled ink and came toward me with a speed that made the chair legs squeal as I jumped back. It was strong here, frighteningly precise. I could see the notch my dentist had made in a molar, the curl of a hangnail. The breath I dragged in felt like it might scratch. It raised its hand and I raised mine, and our fingers were not aligned. In the black of the window over the sink, I saw us both. The me made of flesh, blotched with adrenaline, and the me made of absence, correct to the degree that light would permit. The window showed a third thing, too, thin scratches across the black, tally marks overlapping, more lines than I could count. People who had stood where I stood and flicked switches. People who had misunderstood which side of illumination is safe. I turned every light off. The kitchen dropped into a mild, survivable dark. The shadow that wanted me stood still, its edges softening, disappointed but not vanishing. It lifted its head slightly, and for a second the entire townhouse seemed to press its ear to me. The not me spoke again by absence. You brought enough light. You cut me from yourself with it. Let me print. No, I said, with no authority. I backed to the foyer. The beveled mirror held a faint, lunar version of me, the line of my jaw a suggestion. In that pallor, I saw other shapes move within the silver. Thin shoulders, a bent head, something on its knees. None of them moved exactly when I did. The mirror wasn't reflecting, it was remembering. 3 nights, I said aloud, not knowing who I was bargaining with. Just 3. The unknown number texted me again. If you see it, don't run. A second later, stand in darkness and hold still. It can't keep your outline if you don't give it new ones. Then, don't leave any lights on. How do you know? I typed with shaking fingers, thumb slipping on the screen. I didn't send it. I had the sense that any attention not spent on the room would be borrowed by whatever lived in its edges. So I did what the message said. I stood in the foyer and turned my back to the mirror and let the dark thicken. Every instinct was against it. The not me waited a pace away. If it had lungs, it would have breathed with me. I felt my breath return from somewhere else, as if routed through an unlit hallway. The street lamp outside gave me a thin collar of light. I stepped sideways so that even that would not help. Lights off, the thing's outline began to feather. It leaned forward the way a person does when they're trying to see a faint print, squinting, angling their page to the light. It couldn't get purchase. I held still while my muscles shook and the little motor inside the refrigerator hummed and died and hummed again. The house did not want me motionless. It set to work, a tick behind me like a fingernail on a frame, a sigh under the stair, the smells of old coffee and eucalyptus sharpened as if brought closer by breath. My left knee ached exactly in the place it always aches, and the ache made my leg want to adjust a little. I didn't. A hair fell off my forehead, and I let it itch across my eye. After what felt like the length of a bad year, the outline that was not me thinned like smoke that has finally found an open window. It gave one last little stretch toward what light remained, and then softened into the general dark as if it had been an error correcting itself. Only then did I realize what stayed. Where the not me had hovered, a colder dark persisted like a bruise on the air. It didn't move when I did because it wasn't in the business of mimicking anymore. It had the patience of the tally marks in the window. I felt a tug, not physical, more like the recognition of an unanswered question. If I stepped forward into that cold, it would accept me the way a pocket accepts a coin. I would fit precisely into its lack. The thought didn't frighten me the way I thought it would. There is a strange relief in the idea of being an outline someone else fills in. Not tonight, I said. I took a careful step away. The cold didn't follow. It stayed like a stain. I slept on the couch with every light off and woke at dawn to the sound of birds testing the morning with little questions. The house held no malice in daylight. It had the embarrassed air of someone who had overshared at a party. I packed. I didn't make tea. I set the bathroom soap back exactly as I'd found it, moved the rug's corner straight. The beveled mirror, in mourning, was just a mirror. It returned me nothing I didn't bring to it. On my way out, I turned the hall note over. On the back, in the same neat print, was one more line. If you cannot keep still, break the bulb. An instruction for those who needed movement more than breath. I locked the door. I put the keys back under the terracotta pot where a damp rim told the story of last night's cold. In the early light, the street lamp looked harmless, just a pole with a dull pearl. In the window of the kitchen, a faint fog of breath had dried into fine lines like tree rings. I started to walk away and, halfway down the block, turned. In the oval of frosted glass, I saw a smudge. It could have been a reflection. It could have been a trick of light. It could have been the colder bruise of absence finding a way to keep a shape when I took mine away. I check my shadow now in every room I enter. I stand in doorways and watch how the light cuts me. The trick, I learned, is in the generosity of stillness. Most days I move a lot. I prefer not to give anything the time to draw me well. But when night falls and I switch off lamps in my own place, I sometimes feel a brief cold in the air, like a hand held nearby to see whether it fits mine. I hold very still, and my shadow holds still with me. And on certain nights, in certain rooms, I feel the opposite, an eagerness coming up through the floorboards, a hunger sharpening with the click of a switch. Those nights I do not become a shadow, not fully. I hold darkness like breath until the wanting thins, until morning puts edges back where they belong. But the night I stood in that foyer, the light made me, and I know this. A part of me stayed behind, waiting in the ledger the way a debt waits. If I ever forget to check the switches, if I ever decide I want rest more than shape, I will know exactly where to stand and exactly how to turn my head so that the light can do its work. And when it does, I won't fight. I have already practiced becoming